Welcome everyone to Minor Prophets. We're going to talk about Hosea today. And if you'd like to turn to the book of Hosea, you can do that. While you're turning there, I didn't say this last week when we went through the syllabus, so I want to make sure I said it today. When we were going through the syllabus for New Testament, I talked about the research paper, and I said, any topic you want, pick a book of the Bible or a topic or something from it. I didn't mention the research paper at all, I don't think, with the prophets. But what I want to say about that is don't write one paper about all the prophets because, in a paper as short as what you're doing, there wouldn't be any research. I mean, you could write one paragraph about each of the prophets and, they're without really doing any work to it and fill up a paper easily. So don't just say, I'll do my paper on all the prophets. But if you want to pick one prophet, that would be, I think a good idea. Or if you want to pick, a northern kingdom versus southern kingdom, or you want to write about exile or, anything like that. And again, you can certainly run the topic by me if you want, before you get started and say, hey, do you think this would be a good topic? And if I say, no, that's not a good idea, that way you didn't waste any time. But I'm sure anything you come up with will be fair game. But I did want to clarify, because somebody might get the bright idea, like you got your Hosea overview today, and I'm going to give you just a paragraph or two about each of the prophets. And so somebody might think, man, I can just reproduce these paragraphs here and fill up a quick research paper, but we're not going to do that with the minor prophets. So just wanted to dispel that right away. But again, any questions that you ever have, you can email me or call or text, or I get a lot of Facebook messages too. Ask me anything about the papers or the exams or anything like that, as I'm sure those questions are going to come along the way. But we're going to begin Hosea today, and our schedule allows us to do, unlike the New Testament, where we have to double up a lot of our New Testament books. We don't have to double up any prophets. We can spend a whole class on each prophet. Hosea is a lot. Zechariah is going to be hard to do in one class, but all the rest of them should be, we get to 2 or 3 chapter prophets. It should be pretty good. But Hosea, there's a lot, and we can't cover it all, and we'll try to skip through and get the highlights. But let's begin with this overview before we begin reading in the book of Hosea. Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel, and he had a ministry that spanned approximately the years 760 to 720 BC. And this probably goes without saying, but just in case you don't know, BC numbers count down. We go up, we had 2019, it's 2020. BC counts down into the birth of Christ. So 760 down to 740 is about a 40-year ministry that he had there. Hosea's name means salvation, or help, or deliverance. Those words are used synonymously in Scripture, the Hebrew word. Like you see it a lot in the Psalms. Sometimes it's save me, O God. Sometimes it's the Lord is my deliverance, or whatever. It all comes from the same word. So his name is our word for salvation, and his message is a picture of exactly that. Hosea's life, what he preaches, is a picture of God being our salvation and our deliverance. He prophesied during a time in which Israel experienced economic prosperity, but morally they were in decline. It was a good time for Israel because at the moment there was no war. They weren't in conflict with anybody. They had a relative peace, and when there's peace, you can focus on the economy. They weren't having to put all their money into war and defense, and so things were good economically. And typically, when things get good economically, there's a decline morally. I think we've seen that in America. Such a godly Christian nation for so long. And, post-World War II, we're at the height of the world's economy, and that's when we start to say, we don't need God in public schools, we don't need the 10 Commandments in the courtroom, and we slowly remove God because we don't feel like we need him when everything's going well. Now, that's just a little soapbox sermon there for a second, but things were going so well that we see there was a turning away from God during this time. Hosea was a contemporary, that means on the scene with, at the same time as, Isaiah from the major prophets, and Nahum and Micah, his fellow minor prophets. So those 4 guys were all preaching right around the same time. Now let's talk about the divided kingdom for a minute. I didn't mention the divided kingdom last week, and you may know all about the divided kingdom, and this may be repetitive. However, if you're not aware that the kingdom was divided, then the prophets are really hard to understand. And so I need to spend a minute as we begin the minor prophets now to talk about the divided kingdom, because that helps us through each of the books. But specifically, there's something in here that relates to Hosea. But 931 BC, King Solomon died. Solomon was David's heir, and Solomon's son was Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was the next in line. He was the crown prince. He was from the line of David. He becomes king. But there was people that didn't like Rehoboam being king. And there was a revolt led by someone whose name is very similar and probably tends to trip us up. Jeroboam decided that he was going to be king. So you've got Rehoboam on the one hand and Jeroboam on the other. And it was not a civil war like the American Civil War where it was brother fighting against brother, but there was basically a split. Not a very violent split. There was certainly some mutinies and things, as there always are in a good struggle in a monarchy. But it wasn't, I don't want you to think it's a war that went on for years where, the North is killing the South and things. But there was a split between the 10 tribes that we call the Northern Kingdom, or they retain the name Israel. So many times now in the minor prophets we see Israel, or we might see Ephraim. That is a reference to the north. Now, there were 12 tribes of Israel, and in the north there are 10 tribes. They followed Jeroboam. There were 2 tribes in the south that stayed loyal to Rehoboam, the son of King Solomon. So those 2 tribes are Judah and then Benjamin. So because Judah is the kind of the capital now, the southern kingdom is largely just referred to as Judah. So you have Israel in the north and Judah in the south. But Judah's small. It's just Jerusalem. And last week I gave out a map just to kind of help keep everything in perspective. But in that map you'll notice that Jerusalem is near the southern part of Israel. And so it's you have the north, 10 tribes, most of the territory, and then you've got little Jerusalem down here, just Judah, pretty much making up the southern part of it. And so we have to understand as we go through the prophets, I said at the beginning, Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom. We have to understand the northern kingdom, that's the Assyrian captivity. The southern kingdom, that'll be the Babylonian captivity. And so those are things that we have to keep straight as we try to interpret these books. If we forget it's 2 kingdoms, then we get the 2 captivities confused, and it can be really complicated after that. So if we can remember 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south, then that really helps us keep track of what's going on. But it's important now that we talk about what Jeroboam did as the king of the north, the illegitimate king, if you will. As the king of the north, he had a problem. He said, if my subjects, if the people in the north here are going to obey God's law, because they still followed Yahweh, they still wanted his blessings, they still wanted him to make the crops grow and to make the cattle multiply, they still wanted God's favor, but the kingdom was split. And he knew that his people eventually had to make their way down to Jerusalem if they wanted to go into the temple. What are they supposed to do on Yom Kippur if they can't get in the temple? How can they bring their sacrifices? How can they observe the feast days? So he had to come up with a solution. He said, I don't want my people getting any ideas crossing the border and going to Jerusalem. So he decided that he was going to make his own idols. He made golden calves and he put them along the border, specifically in Dan and in Bethel. And we talked about Bethel last week. It's Hebrew for the house of God. And to me, there's just an ironic picture there of him taking idols and putting them in the house of God, and saying, don't cross the border. You don't need to go to Jerusalem. You can worship right here at these idols. And I think early on people were thinking, well, wait a second. We don't want to worship these idols made by human hands. And he's probably thinking something along these lines. Well, you know what? This is just how we worship Yahweh now. We worship these golden calves, but we think about the Lord while we do it. And I imagine that he probably slowly warmed them up to the idea. He just didn't want them leaving the boundaries of his kingdom. And so he's the one that introduced idol worship into Israel. And from this minute on, the northern kingdom entered down a path of idolatry from which they never returned. And so God used these prophets to constantly tell the kings, get rid of these idols, to tell the people, stop worshiping these idols. But it was really a lost cause in Israel after Jeroboam did what he did. You know why it became such a problem? Well, in order to get people to really get into what he wanted them to do, he did what typically happens when you have idols. He introduced the concept of cult prostitutes along with them. So you're not just worshiping these golden calves now, but now you're visiting the prostitutes. He found a way to maybe appeal to people's physical senses and say, well, here, go do that. And there's people that say, well, okay, we want to do that. And so they began doing that. And so he put prostitutes now around these idols. And so before you know it, the people that with their lips, they're worshiping Yahweh, they're loyal to God, they're saying, we're going to obey God, but with their actions, they're bowing down to golden calves and they're visiting these prostitutes. And so you can see so many times in the prophets where God talks about, well, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. That's why he would say, I despise your feast because I know what you do Monday to Friday, and I see what you try to do when you come into, like we might say, when you come into church on Sunday. And so the people were living really two different lives. On the one hand, it was, we worship God and God alone. And on the other, it's, we bow down to idols and we visit cult prostitutes. And so the reason I emphasize those prostitutes is one of those prostitutes is a major player here in the book of Hosea. So let's pick back up here on your overview here. Hosea, the third paragraph. Hosea was called by God to get married as an enacted parable. Ezekiel is the prophet who's probably most famous for the enacted parables, whereas Isaiah preaches with a lot of words. Jeremiah does a few things. I mean, he shatters the pottery and the land where the potter's field. But Ezekiel's known more for acting out his sermons instead of talking. God says, I'm going to close your mouth. I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth, and you will act out what I want you to do. And so Ezekiel, we see him laying on his side for a year, baking his food over dung when he's told to. He builds a little army scene. He digs a hole in his wall and crawls out. All this without saying a word to anybody. They would just watch him day after day. Well, Hosea has kind of a blend of that. He has these enacted parables that he acts out using his life to preach the message, but he also uses a lot more words than Ezekiel. So Hosea has a really unique opportunity here. So God says, I want you to get married. And he's probably thinking, okay, God, yeah, this is great. I get to be a prophet, preach your word. You're going to give me a wife now. What's she going to be like, God? A godly woman, and we can have a godly family and raise godly kids, and we'll just do all kinds of godly things? Well, that's not what happens at all, is it? God says, in the King James, he says, take a wife of whoredom, quite possibly telling him to marry one of those very cult prostitutes that had been set up along the border. The NIV says that she was an adulterous wife. The Living Bible says she is a girl who is a prostitute. So Hosea is told, her name is Gomer, he's told to marry a girl who's a prostitute. He obeys God, and he does that. And then they begin to have children together. God used the naming of their children as part of the prophecy. So even the names of the kids are enacted parables. Every time he gave the kids a name, he was acting out a sermon from God. This is part of your homework, so you know the children's names. The first one was Jezreel, which means God sows or scatters. But the reason I assigned that as a homework question is I want you to know not just what the word itself means, but to get the background, and Feinberg does a good job of explaining the background on Jezreel. It was not just that the word itself means God sows or scatters, but what specifically took place in Jezreel. And that is the place where King Ahab and his wicked wife Jezebel were murdered by Jehu, and then the 70 sons of Ahab were also murdered there. See, Jehu wanted the throne for himself, and he did not want a prince to rise up and claim that he had a right to the throne. Well, the problem is there's 70 princes, so he had to murder 70 people. So Jezreel has been associated then with slaughter. I mean, it was a real bloodbath. When people talked about Jezreel, everybody knew what that meant. Now, there's other things that happened there, but when you hear Jezreel, you think about Ahab and Jezebel, you think about 70 sons, you think Jehu murdered all these people, and that forever changed what the association with that city in the minds of everybody else. So, at the time that this was written, Jehu's dynasty was still on the throne. So when Hosea names their son Jezreel, everybody would not only know what the word itself meant, God scatters, but they would associate that with what Jehu did in Jezreel, and they're still on the throne. So here's the meaning that everybody would get from that. God is going to finally bring judgment to the family, the dynasty of Jehu. And they would all understand that that's what that means. God is going to scatter the very family that only got on the throne because they scattered or destroyed or murdered all the people from the family of King Ahab. So the name of the first son that they have together itself is a judgment. The next child, they have a daughter. Her name is Lo Ruhama, which means no pity or unpitied. The English Standard Version actually says no mercy. It doesn't use the Hebrew. It just names her as no mercy. And the idea here is that, first of all, you would think if a child had that name, it would be like the parent says, we have no pity, no mercy, no love for our baby. Terrible name for a kid, right? I mean, I don't know that you can think of a worse name for your child. But that's what God says. Name your precious little girl, and just put her hair up in pigtails and name her no mercy, no love, no pity. But the idea is not that they didn't love their little girl, but that God was no longer going to show mercy or pity to Israel, to the northern kingdom. And then finally, the other son, Lo Ammi, means not my people. And again, the idea here is God looks at Israel and says, not anymore. You're no longer my people. So you go back to Mount Sinai, and Moses comes down with the law, and he reads it to the people. And the Lord says, if you obey all the words in this covenant, I will be your God, and you will be my people. And they said, okay, we'll do it. All the words of the Lord we will obey. But they're not. They're going, instead of have no other gods before me, they have these golden calves. Instead of not making any graven image, they have these golden calves. They're going to the prostitutes. They're not worshiping God alone. And now, in essence, taking his name in vain, because anytime they tried to worship Yahweh and then go to the golden calf, everything they just did to God was in vain. Their religion became empty. They were not obeying the words of the covenant. God says, you're not my people. I was your God, you were my people, but now I'm one of your gods, and you're no longer my people. So the names of these children were given as judgment. There's something unique about this, though. I want us to look, if you're in Hosea chapter 1, let's start with verse 2. It says, when the Lord began to speak by Hosea, or Yahweh said to Hosea, go, take for yourself a wife of harlotry. This is a New King James, by the way. Take a wife of harlotry, and the children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel. For in a little while I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel and the house of Jehu, and bring an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It shall come to pass in that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. But now look at verse 6. And she conceived again and bore a daughter. So if you compare verse 6 with what it says in verse 2, he went in and took Gomer, and she conceived and bore him a son. Verse 6, she conceived and bore a daughter. So on the one hand, he goes into his wife, she conceives and bears him a child. And the next one, she conceives, but it does not say Hosea went into his wife. Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. So she conceives, but bears, doesn't say bears him a child, but bears a child. And then, verse 8, now when she had weaned Lo Ruhama, she conceived and bore a son. Does not say bore him a son. So I believe, and I think most people would agree, everybody I've read seems to have the same idea, that the first child is Hosea's, no doubt. Jezreel is Hosea's baby boy. But these next two, not pitied, Lo Ruhama and Lo Ammi, not my people. I imagine if Maury Povich had a TV show back then, I can just imagine Povich sitting down with Hosea and saying, you are not the father. These are not his kids. I could be wrong about that, but I think that the text here, specifically leaving him out, she did not bear him a daughter, she bore a daughter. He did not go into her, and I think the text is written that way to give us a little clue. Now, Hosea is raising him. He's naming him. They're going to be in his house, but he knows. I would imagine if we could be a fly on the wall inside the home of Hosea and Gomer, he's probably sleeping on the couch. I mean, I don't think there's really any love between these two. He's commanded to love her, and he does. And he does his duty as a husband, and he goes into her, and she conceives. But from then on, I would imagine that it's just not really a great home life. The relationship between them is probably not fantastic. Now, Back right before Thanksgiving, I preached from Hosea, and I thought about doing this in here, but I just decided against it. But the way I presented Hosea was through a dramatic monologue. On a Sunday night, without saying anything, I got up and just as if I were Hosea, I just began to tell Hosea's story. And part of the way I did it, I wanted people to understand where I think Hosea was coming from. I think he thought, I'm going to be her knight in shining armor. She probably hates her life, hates her job, hates what she has to do. I will rescue her from that, and she's going to love me forever. I mean, I'm like the prince who rescues the princess from slays the dragon, right? And she's going to love me, and I imagine she resented him. I imagine she missed her way of life because he has rules. He has a God. He doesn't do all the things that everybody else in Israel was doing, with the exception of, just Isaiah, right? I mean, everybody else is going to these prostitutes. Everybody else is worshiping the golden calves. Not Hosea. As for me and my house, he probably tells Gomer, we're going to serve the Lord. And I imagine she resented him for that. And so these other two children she conceived, she may well have gone back into prostitution, whether she was being paid by some guy or whether she was a temple prostitute, that she was going back to that. Whatever the case may have been, I don't think Hosea and his wife had a great relationship together.
She wasn't making a good living because she was eating barley.
Because she was what?
Eating barley.
Eating barley, yeah, that's the boy. Yeah, so was her father. That's another thing there. Her father's mentioned in verse 2, Diblaim, the fact that his name is mentioned. Verse 3, I'm sorry. We might think of this young girl being a prostitute. We might think maybe she ran away from home at a young age. Maybe her parents died when she was young and she got caught up into maybe some of the things that we might think are factors in a girl today. But her father's mentioned. And so I think the fact that her father's mentioned shows that he's in the picture, so to speak, that she knows her father, has a relationship with her father, to the point when Hosea marries her, I believe that he paid a dowry to this man for the ability, for the right to be able to marry Gomer. And so Hosea doesn't just go and find him a wife. He pays the dowry, I imagine, and possibly even had to purchase her from whether there was a man who owned her or pimped her out, so to speak. Can we say that here? but whether if that was the case, I believe that Hosea, in order to obey God and preach this message, it cost him something. Not only to be married to a perfect stranger who was nothing like him, didn't worship his God in any way, but it cost him out of pocket, that he had to pay the price to marry her, possibly to purchase her out of slavery, and then, as we're going to see again later, purchases her again when she runs back to that life. But we'll get to that in a second. So, the main theme of the book is man's unfaithfulness, which is pictured in Gomer, contrasted with God's forgiveness, which is pictured in Hosea. So Hosea gets this great privilege of getting to represent God in the story, but in order to do so, he has to marry a prostitute, and then live with a prostitute, and then raise children that she probably conceived with some strangers. So he gets to picture God, but at what price? But it just shows us we are Gomer. Before we can point a finger at her and say, oh, she's terrible, we have to realize that we are the ones that are prone to spiritual adultery, to running from God. At Mount Sinai, they said, we're going to do everything you say to do, God, and yet they ran from God. They prostituted themselves, spiritually speaking, when God is supposed to be the groom, and they ran away. And we do the same thing when we don't trust God, when we do things we know we're not supposed to do. And so we become like Gomer, and God is like Hosea, willing to forgive us when we don't deserve it. There is, the last thing on this overview here, there's a chiastic structure of Hosea. If you're not familiar with a chiasm or a chiastic structure, it is kind of like an outline, but it is, the prophets use these quite a bit. And interestingly, the entire epistle of James, all 5 chapters, is composed as a chiastic structure. Robert and I were talking a little bit about that earlier, and of course we'll get to James in the New Testament, but here's a nice little chiastic structure. What happens here is the author or speaker will introduce several points briefly, then reach a climax, and then work backwards in reverse order, hitting each of those points again. So you have, in this case, A, B, C, and D, and then C1, B1, and A1 as you work your way back. So at the very beginning, we see Hosea marries Gomer. Then we see renewal of the covenant between them. He could have divorced her, but he didn't. Then we see Yahweh's judgment on Israel. He tells them that they're guilty. And then the climax here is this. There's no acknowledgement of God in Israel. So working their way back, once again, Yahweh's judgment on Israel. Then another renewal of the covenant. And then Hosea and Gomer are reunited. Because God in chapter 3 tells him to go take Gomer back and to love her again. So that chiasm there to me is very interesting. And I think that, if we keep that in mind as we're reading through Hosea, it makes it a little bit clearer to us. Excuse me. So when I preached this before, I preached that there was a messed up marriage. And then I said there was a deserving divorce. He could have put her away, and God could divorce Israel. That's what he says, I will divorce you. But then there's a righteous restoration. When no one would blame Hosea for divorcing his wife, but he brings her back. No one could blame God for divorcing Israel, and yet God brings Israel back. So I'd like you to turn to chapter 3 of Hosea, please. A very difficult verse here. It was hard in chapter 1 when he says, go marry a woman from harlotry. Chapter 3, verse 1, he says, then the Lord said to me, go again and love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to other gods, and they love the raisin and the cakes of the pagans. So look what he does in verse 2. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and 1.5 homers of barley. You mentioned the barley a minute ago. That was part of the price of him purchasing her back. So this clearly tells us she's an adulteress. This tells her she is loved by a lover, not her husband. She has lovers on the side, whether they were in love or whether it was a business transaction, we don't know. But God says, go and love her again. Love is a command. It's not a feeling. We fall in love. He commands Hosea to love her, and Hosea has to obey that command and love this unlovable person. We see this in Ruth. We certainly see that this is the way God loves us when we are unlovable. And that ought to just make you say amen. I mean, what a great feeling that is, because again, we are Gomer. We are running from God. And he says to Hosea, you go love her again, because I will love you again. And so what does Hosea have to do? He has to reach back into his wallet. He has to come up with the money, 15 shekels of silver and some barley, just for good measure. And he has to go pay to get his wife back. That is the very definition of the word redemption. To redeem, to purchase something, or to purchase something again. He's purchased her once, he has to purchase her again. And of course, Peter tells us that we were redeemed, not with corruptible things like silver or gold or shekels of barley, but we were redeemed with the precious blood of Jesus Christ as a lamb without blemish and spot. And so this, without realizing it, is a picture of what Jesus will one day do for us. It's what God did for Israel, near, far, fulfillment again. This is what God is doing for Israel, but way down in the future, this is what Jesus will do when he sheds his blood on the cross. He will redeem us, and he will love us. So chapter 3 is a great, it's a short chapter, but it's a very great part of the book, just 5 verses there. So let's talk about, let's flip ahead to chapter 11, actually. Chapter 11 is another really important chapter in this book. This says, when Israel was a child, this is God speaking through Hosea, but when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, the second half of that verse there is important. Do you recognize that from anything? Out of Egypt I've called my son. Well, in Matthew chapter 2, he quotes this, but he uses it about Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and Herod is trying to kill him, and so they slip into Egypt, and then when the coast is clear, they go back, and Matthew says that it might be fulfilled what was written, out of Egypt I've called my son. He's quoting here from Hosea 11:1. Now again, this is so interesting because this is not a prophecy. Hosea 11:1 is not a prophecy that one day God's going to call his son out of Egypt. It's not prophecy at all, it's history. When was Israel in Egypt? This goes back to the book of Exodus. So Hosea 11:1 is actually historical. It's not a future prophecy, it's history. And he uses personification here. He takes the nation of Israel and he personifies Israel as if it's an infant boy. My son, God says. I loved you when you were a little baby, and I called my son out of Egypt. So when Israel was in its infancy as a nation, that's when they were slaves in Egypt. And so God sends Moses to bring them out and send them to the promised land. So the Bible is the most incredible book ever written. Only in the Bible can you have history that is poetically personified and yet at the same time be a prophecy that gets fulfilled. And Hosea is not thinking about Jesus. Hosea is talking about Exodus and Israel and their history, and in a beautiful way personifies them as an infant baby. And yet Matthew can look at Mary, Joseph, and Jesus leaving Egypt for where? The promised land, for Jesus to go back home to Israel, and look at that and say, out of Egypt I've called my son. I mean, that is just so complex if you start to unpack all of those things there. And so just that one quick passage, and yet Matthew uses it to his Jewish audience to show them that Jesus fulfills prophecy. And it's not even actual prophecy because it's not a prediction. It's speaking of history. But then the next verse 2, it says, they called them, and so they went from there, and they sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to carved images. I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love, and I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck. I stooped and I fed them. So God is picturing himself here as a loving father. Israel was this tiny little baby in Egypt, but now growing into a stumbling toddler. So now God is holding them by the hands and teaching them to walk. And it's like they don't even realize that God is the one, like a loving father, teaching them to walk. So look what they do instead. God is stooping down and feeding them, but yet they're running to the other idols. In verse 5, he shall not return to the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king. This is a prophecy now about the Assyrian captivity. Because they refuse to repent, and the sword shall slash in his cities, devour his districts, and consume them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt him. So now God's speaking of punishment. As a father, I love them as my infant son, now as my toddler. They're running from me, so here comes the sword. Here comes Assyria. It's not going to be pretty. But then he turns on a dime again in verse 8 and he says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? And how can I set you like Zeboim? My heart churns within me. My sympathy is stirred. I will not execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not again destroy you, he says, for I am God and not man. And so in this one passage, he goes from this father-like love to saying, but I'm going to bring the hammer down on you because of your idolatry. But then he says, but how can I give you up? How can I turn you over? How can this really be the end? Because my compassion is stirred. My sympathy is yearning within me for you. And so we see the love of God through all of this. We see mercy and compassion and forgiveness. On the one hand, talking about the judgment that they deserve, and on the other, the forgiveness that they could never earn.
And that's heartbreak. It's the heartbreak.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And like Jesus would often say, or who said of Jesus, he had compassion on them as sheep with no shepherd. But we see here that this is Hosea and Gomer all over again. It's, I love you, you deserve divorce, you deserve to be put away. He could have had her executed under the law, but instead, how can I put you away? You're my wife, you're the mother of my children, and so instead he brings her back. And so we see God, the Assyrians are going to come, judgment will come, but it's not going to be forever. God's always saying, if there's a remnant, if you'll repent, I will always love you, I will always give you other chances. Any questions on anything so far before we go to the next part? All right. Well, here, let's talk about one other thing. Let's talk about spiritual adultery, and then, we'll wrap this up. So in chapter 6 through 8, and we can't read all this, but in 6 through 8, we see two groups of sixes, where, first of all, Hosea uses word pictures to describe Israel's sin, and then he uses word pictures to describe God's judgment against them. So without us being able to really pick these apart, we'll move through them kind of quickly. But the prophets were wordsmiths. They were so good at describing whatever they were trying to get across. And so he uses object after object after object here to describe their sin, and then to turn the page and do the same with the judgment. So first we see Israel's sin in chapter 6 and 7. Beginning in verse 4, he compares Israel's love to the morning dew. You know, you go outside in the morning, the grass is wet. 10 minutes later, where'd the dew go? You know, it's like it's gone just as quickly, as is Israel's love. Oh, you love me at Mount Sinai. You agreed to everything at Mount Sinai, but your love has evaporated just like the morning dew. In chapter 7, the first verse, he compares Israel to a hot oven. Of course, in their days, the oven, they had to use coal to get warmth for their fire. And he says, your passion for sin is so hot that nobody needs to stoke the fire. Nobody needs to keep it going. It's not going to burn out during the night. They would heat their homes the same way. Before going to bed, they'd build a good fire in their house when it was cold. But if nobody got up during the night to stoke the fire and keep it going, they'd wake up shivering. And so oftentimes they'd have to do that to get up and make it warmer. But he says, your passion for sin is so hot that it burns all night without any assistance. In verse 8 of chapter 7, he compares them to half-baked cakes. Now, a cake is not like our dessert that we might have at a birthday. The cake for them was, think about like a big dinner roll. And each of their meals had one of these cakes. It was a staple for so many of their dishes. But he says your cakes have not been flipped. You know, when you cook, a lot of things have to be flipped halfway through. And if you don't flip them, you may end up with something hard on one side and soft on the other. So you flip it and try to make sure it's cooked through evenly. So what's his point here? A cake that was not flipped over. On the one hand, it's so hard that God can't penetrate. He can't get through to them. I think of Revelation 3:20. I stand at the door and knock. You know, but it's this hard, burnt crust. You know, I can't get in. But the underside is so soft that when the Assyrian army gets here, they're just going to walk right through that warm, doughy, undercooked center. And so like an unflipped cake, you're so hard I can't get in, but so soft you can't keep Israel out. And that's just a really clever wordplay there, isn't it? I love that about Hosea. Next, number 4, in chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, this is another great one. He compares him to an old man. He says, you're like an aging man, but the problem is you don't know you've lost your strength. You've probably seen that. You know, maybe someone in your life, your father, your grandfather, somebody, and they think they can do what they've always done, and that's hard for a man when he has to admit, I can't lift this anymore, I can't work that hard anymore, I can't, do the things that I used to do because I'm getting older. But occasionally you see that stubborn old man that just doesn't seem to admit, oh no, I can still do that, oh, I can still lift that, and he throws out his back and he gets a hernia or has a heart attack or something because he just can't do what he used to do. He says to Israel, you are like a man who's getting old and losing strength, but you don't realize it. In their younger days, when Israel was a young man, they were able to go to war with all their enemies. They could walk around the walls of Jericho without firing a shot and the walls fall down. Well, because it's not in their strength. They're being obedient to God, and He's fighting their battles for them. But as they aged, and they stopped doing it in God's strength, they stopped obeying Him, God stops fighting their battles for them. So Israel's left like an old man thinking, oh, Assyria, please, we've beaten Jericho, we've beaten all these Canaanite cities, we've beaten the Philistines, oh, we got this. And like an old man that doesn't realize his strength is gone, they're soon going to find out that they're no match for the Assyrians because God is not going to be fighting their battles for them. In chapter 7, verses 11 and 12, this is one of your homework questions too, but he compares them to a silly dove, just a bird flying back and forth between Egypt and Assyria. And what they didn't realize is that both Egypt and Assyria are dove hunters. They're like a silly dove going back and forth, trying to make alliances with two countries, not realizing that both countries want them to be conquered. Both countries want to turn them into tax-paying vassal states. And so they think they're doing themselves favors with these political alliances, but they're like a silly dove flying back and forth between two people that want to kill them. And then in chapter 7, verses 13 to 16, he compares them to an unproved bow. Oh, of course, like the bow and arrow. A weapon that they've never tested, they've never practiced. Imagine the audacity of going into battle and saying, I don't need to test this. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll just go out there and I'll wing it. And that's what he accuses them of doing. to take a bow that they've never fired and to go into battle, how foolish that would be. It's the opposite of David and Goliath. You remember David and Goliath when here comes this little shepherd boy and King Saul says, well, here, David, put on my armor and here, take my weapons. And what does David say? I have not proved these. I'm not going to use these. First of all, the armor didn't fit. It was way too big for little David. But he said, I'm not going to use these weapons that I've never used. I'm going to go in the name of the Lord. And he said, there's no way that the Lord will allow me to lose to this uncircumcised Philistine. He's not one of us. He's defying our God. And God is going to fight for me. God is going to give us victory. And Israel used to do that. Now they're going into battle with unproved weapons, and they're just saying, we'll be fine. It's always worked out for us before. But the difference is they're not going in God's strength again, and so they're going to be severely disappointed. So in these 2 chapters, he gives 6 word pictures to describe their sin. They're no longer trusting God, their passion for immorality, and that leads to 6 word pictures for God's sentence. Israel's sin, then God's sentence. And we see all these in chapter 8. First of all, the chapter begins with a shofar blast, which was their way of alerting the people that God was going to decree his divine sentence. And here's what he begins to say. In the first 6 verses, he talks about a flying eagle, or vulture, I should say. There's debate as to what kind of bird it is, but it's believed to be a bird of prey, whether it's a vulture or something else. So when you look up and you see a bird circling overhead, what does that usually mean? Why is the bird circling around? Something's dead, yeah. So God is saying through Hosea, there's a bird right now circling over Israel. Why? Something's about to die. And so this is not a pretty picture. God is saying that there is about to be some carnage. There are going to be carcasses in Israel. When the Assyrians come through, there's going to be plenty for the vultures to eat, because there's going to be a lot of lives lost at the hands of the Assyrian army. They're going to be God's instrument to bring judgment. In verse 7, God's sentence, he uses the analogy of a farmer, a reaping farmer, an agricultural metaphor. There's 2 pictures here of the farmer. First of all, he says there's going to be an empty harvest. That's devastating to people that are farmers, that when their economy relies on it. And it's harvest season and nothing comes. The whole year is a wash. That'll destroy the economy. People will starve with an empty harvest. But then the second part of the picture is, every now and then, here and there, some stuff is going to grow, but it's going to be eaten by other people. So you're going to try to grow all this stuff. You're not going to get anything yourself. There'll be little bits over here. Well, the Assyrian army, when they walk through, they're going to help themselves. After they're done killing all of you and rounding you up and taking you off, they're also going to pick your crops. To add insult to injury, they're going to eat the few things that actually grew from what you plucked. I mean, that's just a really specific curse that God is pronouncing on them here. Next, verse 8, he compares them to worthless pottery. Pottery that is broken is not really good for anything. I haven't found a use for broken pottery. If anybody does, let me know. But he says, there was a time when Israel served a purpose. There was a time when the Queen of Sheba traveled from around the world to see King Solomon. There was a time when they first crossed the Jordan River, when the book of Joshua says that everybody was shut up with fear because of Israel, because of the name of the Lord. And yet, all these years later, there's no queens coming to visit Israel's kings. There's nobody shut up with fear because of Israel. You've got Assyria and Egypt that can't wait to get their hands on Israel. And so, like a useless pottery, they have nothing to offer anybody. Nobody's interested in them anymore. And so then next in verse 9, he compares them to a wild donkey, living on their own, wandering around with no owner or no purpose. They don't realize that they're alone. They think that everything is good. They think that everything's just fine, but very soon they're going to find that they're in a lot of trouble. And so in verses 9 and 10, he compares his judgment to an adulterous prostitute. He says that Israel doesn't want to be alone like a wild donkey, and so they're hiring lovers for themselves, in essence going into prostitution. That may fill a void for some time, but obviously that is not a good long-term solution. Israel could have returned to their husband, the Lord, but instead, he's saying, you're choosing to prostitute yourselves. Now, you know what they were doing is they were sending tribute money to Egypt and to Assyria, basically paying taxes to these countries for protection. If we send you money, will you guys keep us safe? And so it's like he says not only are you a prostitute, but you are paying people to be a prostitute. Instead of taking money like most prostitutes will do, you're actually paying them to let you go be a prostitute. In other words, he's saying you're paying taxes to these countries, prostituting yourselves to them for protection, paying instead of being paid, you're giving up your money, when all this time you could just come back to me. Just return to the Lord. I will protect you, and I won't tax you to do it. Just come back to me, and you'll be fine. But they don't. And so finally, he uses the analogy of Egyptian slavery. If you have chapter 8 there, look in verse 11. He says, because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for him altars for sinning. I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. So we hear about returning to Egypt. When was Israel in Egypt before? Well, we just talked about that, when they were in bondage in Egypt. But they never go back to Egypt. And so this is one of those times where it can be tricky for us to understand. They don't return to Egypt, but here he says, you're going back to Egypt as slaves. So last week I used the word metonymy. I talked about some of these metaphors. I said we've got to identify metaphors or we can't get the right interpretation here. Metonymy is substituting one word for something else. So here, Egypt is an example of metonymy. He's inserting Egypt here in place of Assyria. So it's kind of strange that they would do that, but they did not expect the Assyrian captivity yet. And so by using something they know, they can picture Egyptian slavery. So by saying you're going to go back to Egypt, that doesn't mean literally the country of Egypt. You're going back to what you were in Egypt. You're going back to slavery. It's not going to be south in Egypt. It's going to be north in Assyria. And so if we don't recognize that as being a metaphor for Assyria, then we can say, well, hang on, they never went back to Egypt. This is a mistake. But it's actually an example of metonymy as a metaphor there. So 6 word pictures for God's judgment that follow 6 word pictures for Israel's sin. Hosea just goes on a roll there, rattling off these very descriptive object lessons for him there. You know what? That's pretty much Hosea. I think that's a good place to stop. There's more we can say, but I think we can call it a day there in Hosea. Are there any questions about Hosea or comments or anything else? Well, chapter 14 is the good news there. Israel restored at last is what the heading in my Bible says. But in chapter 14, it's future tense. It's one of those far off prophecies. Hasn't happened yet, but they'll be restored in the millennial kingdom, as so many of the prophets indicate. If the good news isn't now, if the good news isn't in 70 years, the good news is coming in the millennial kingdom. So there's always a glimmer of hope there with the prophets. So, all right, well, if there's nothing, I'll turn the video off and we'll have a word of prayer and we can close. But the homework this week is from Joel, and I've emailed those out.